Good morning. We're continuing with Yoreh Deah, Sadi Aleph, Basar B'chalav. We are with Seif Hey. Okay. First, I'm going to read the Shulchan, and then we'll read the Ramah afterwards. Maliach she'eni yachol le'achol machmat molcho. So here the Shulchan is clear that when we're talking about maliach, that it could be keroteach, it has to be where it's very salty, that you can't eat it. It's too salty to eat. Dahainu ke'ein maliach shemochin lekadera. Such as whenever we're going to salt the meat to kosher it, we put a lot of salt on it, and then that starts the koshering process to remove the blood. So that's the same amount of salt that's necessary for it to be roteach. All right, if it's just you sprinkle a little bit of salt, then that's not the din of roteach. It's the same as being cold meat that has no salt on it. V'shaha kadei melicha v'kadera. And according to the Shulchan Aruch, it has to be where it's been salted for 18 minutes. So it's very salty for 18 minutes. So as long as it stays considered roteach until you rinse it off and soak it, as we'll see. Now it'll be easier if you understand. Let's first read the Shulchan Aruch. So we're going to skip the Ramah right now. So it'll be a proper sentence. Umaliach ke'in maliach, the ba'alei le'orcha, afilu achar shi, okay. Also, if you salt it, even more salty, make it even more salty, you want to preserve it or cure it. So you're traveling, and so you want to put a lot of salt on there. So that's either case. Afilu achar shehidicho have eino nechal machmat molcho. Even right after you rinse it, it still has a din of eino nechal machmat molcho. V'kol zman shel sharu b'mayim dino keroteach le'asor. So it's so salty in this case, you have to soak it with water in order to remove the status of meliach keroteach. Okay. So if it is salty, right, it's established, it's in one of these examples, it's very salty, so then it's dino keroteach le'esor. This meat, it's very salty as a din of being hot, so it could be oser something else, kedei klipa. So if it's on a level of maliach, then it's oser only kedei klipa. Ve'ein chiluk bein, like if it touches cheese, exactly. If it touches something else, or iser, whatever it is, it's oser something else, kedei klipa. You know what? Maybe let's just finish reading this part. Ve'ein chiluk bein maliach elyon v'tefel tachton. Now it doesn't matter which is on top or on bottom. If the salty meat is on top, v'tefel tachton, and some other piece of let's say cheese for basar b'chalav, but it could be by treif also, from one to another, whatever the situation is. But it doesn't matter if the maliach's on top and the tefel means unsalted, is below, tachton. L'maliach tachton v'tefel elyon. Or if the salty is on the bottom and the unsalted piece of food is on top. Doesn't matter, as long as they're touching, right? As opposed to tata gavar by heat. Correct. Well, sort of, because it could also be oser kedei klipa, even if whichever one. Anyways, it could be the same. Le'olam hamaliach mavliya batefel. Always when the maliach, the salty food, imparts its flavor into the thing that it's touching, into the tefel, or if they're both salty, but it imparts it to something else. Ve'eno bulea mimenu. But the salty item doesn't absorb from the non-salty. Hilkach. Therefore, here's your example. Basar gvina. You have meat and cheese. Hamluchim shenagu zeh bazeh. If they're both salty and they're touching each other, tzarich liklof shneim makom negiatam. So then, where they're touching, you have to remove kadei, you have to cut off a very thin layer, liklof, kadei klipa, from both of them, because they're both imparting onto each other. V'im echad mehem maluach, but if either one of them is very salty, v'hasheni tefel, and the second one is unsalted, so then hamaluach matar bahadacha, whatever is the salty one that doesn't absorb, so all you have to do is just rinse off whatever it touched. V'hatefel tzarich kadei klipa, but the one that's unsalted is the one that absorbs, and that's the one that needs to be kedei klipa. Okay, now let's go back to the Haggah. V'yesh omrim de la'achar sheshaha b'mocho shi'ar melicha lo michrei achar kach roteach. Now there is an opinion, not lechatchila, but there is a kula opinion, mekel opinion, that says it starts out meliach karoteach, but then once it hits 18 minutes, then it cools down, and it's no longer meliach karoteach. Well, tzarach gadol kegon behefsid meruba, but if there's a tzarach gadol, then one could be mekel even after 18 minutes. If it's a hefsid meruba, v'u tzarach suuda mitzvah yesh lismach al ha-mekilim. So if you're in a bind, an extreme bind, one can be mekel if it touched after 18 minutes and not call it meliach karoteach. Aval belav hachi, without this kula, ein lahakel klal. But normally, it's one cannot be mekel. Afilu lo nimlach babasar. Afilu lo nimlach babasar mishnei tzdadim rak mitzad echad. Right. So we learned by melicha lechatchila you're supposed to salt both sides, all the way around. However, if you only salt one side, it still works. So the same thing here. Even if you salt only one side, it has a din of maliach keroteach.
So you salted one side, both sides are considered roteach.
I think only when it's the area that's salty has a din of roteach. The other side that's not salty, I don't think has a din of roteach. Okay, good point. I haven't seen anything on that one though. Because there's no
only the place that
it's salty that's touching, that's what has the power to Chazal established salty has.
It's not an equation between doubles and malicha. Where is it?
It's similar but not exactly the same. Okay. Afil lo nimlach habasar mishnei atzim rak mitzad echad. Kol shenimlach melicha. Once one side, at least one side, is very salty, that you can't eat it, then at least that side we'll call has a din of roteach. Okay. But if it's not very salty, mechashev kokach, mechashev tzonen, it's considered cold. Afilu nimlach mishnei tzdadim. Even if you sprinkle a little salt on either side, that's still called tzonen. V'yesh omrim, and that's the psak of the Shulchan Aruch. V'yesh omrim, but then the Ramah says, wait, the anan and became a davar. We're not experts. We don't really know what is called salty. V'yesh lanu l'chashav afilu melicha tzli keroteach. Even a little bit of salty. You add a little bit of salt, like when you want to roast it, you just throw on some salt to taste. So some say it means enough salt that it needs to be normally to taste, not 1 grain of salt, but you put on a little bit of salt like you normally do to make it taste good. That's what it's talking about. There's an opinion that says also it has to also have a little bit of a salty taste, a little more than normal. Okay. V'tov lahachmer b'makom she'ein hefsed meruba. And one should be machmer whenever unless there's a hefsed meruba. Right. Okay. So normally, once you put a little bit of salt, then it's also according to the Ramah as a din of maliach keroteach. Okay. So that's a big difference between the Mechaber and the Ramah. Okay. So now let's skip to the next Haggah. Haga. V'yesh omrim, de bechol melicha anu misha'arim b'shishim. And some say that whenever we're doing melicha, and this again is also the opinion of the Rama, is once it's meliach keroteach, then you look at the entire item, and it needs to be what's it called? Has to be batal b'shishim. Otherwise, both items are going to oser each other all the way through.
In other words, klipa is not good.
And klipa is not good enough. Correct. Okay.
And the mahliya.
But we'll see this in Kufay. What was it? Kufay will explain it better. V'had tahor maluach v'tamei tafel shari. Now, if you have a kosher piece of meat and it's salty, and a treif piece of meat and it's unsalted, shari, and they're touching each other, when do we say it's mutter to eat the tahor? Hainu she'atame yavesh. So that's only if it's dry. But imhu davar tzalo ne'asar tahor. Me'achar she'eno nechal machmat mocho b'leya eser she'etzlo. So that's what we said, the Rama writes, that it only can give out the flavor to the other item, but it doesn't absorb. That's if the maliach is very dry. But if it's juicy, so then it can also absorb. Ushneim asurim, and then it's going to both. It's going to be mavliya and nivla. It's going to both boleya. V'davka shetahor lach ktsat. Right, but it must be where it's moist.
The isser is also the isser is moist, and the tar is a little moist.
The maliach has to be moist. Imhu yavesh lagamre, but if the maliach is completely dry, eno buleya midavar lach she'etzlo. Even though the other item is moist, or wet, it doesn't matter. It's not going to absorb. Okay. Tough. And then all you have to do is just rinse it off. Fine. Okay, let's continue. V'im hem yeveshim. Now, what if they're both dry? Afilu hem meluchim. If they're completely dry, and they're both salty, olachim, v'lo machmat melicha, or they're not very salty, it's only a little bit of salty, and they're wet. Sagi be'adacha, it's enough just to rinse it off. So the only time it's a problem is if the maliach is moist and it has to be maliach that it's very salty, right? You can't eat it. Okay. Otherwise, you just have to do adacha. The Rama was machmer with a little bit of salt, correct, but still has to be moist. Okay. Haga. Kol tzir mi basar shenimlach, afil lo nimlach rak litzli chashuv roteach. Okay, so now the Rama adds though, the basar that's very salty could be yavish, and it could be that it doesn't, it's not a problem of maliach keroteach. However, let's say now some tzir, some brine comes out, some juice melts off of the ice, off of the salt that's on the meat. So this tzir, this brine, is a liquid. That does have a din of maliach keroteach. Afilu nimlach rak litzli chashuv roteach. Even if it's only a little bit of salty, and you didn't put it, and it wasn't very salty. Once you add some salt, and now you have juice coming out of the meat with this salt, even if it's not heavily salted, it becomes keroteach. Ulachein, im nafal tzir al hagavina. If you have this tzir that comes off of the beef, off of the meat, and it drips onto cheese, o al kli, or even onto a kli, oser. Afilu b'makom she'ena basar oser. Even if the meat wouldn't oser the item, if it touched it, but the tzir is oser. The lo nechshav roteach. Even if the basar is not considered roteach, the tzir is considered roteach. Mikol makom, hatzir chashiv, eino nechal machmat mocha. Because the tzir itself is pure salt with a little bit of meat juice, and that's very concentrated. And so that juice is very salty, and that tzir has a din of maliach karoteach. V'tzir shel.
So you wash off the meat.
Well, so then, if it drips onto the gvina, or if it drips onto the kli, you have to kasher it. And according to the Shulchan Aruch would be kedei klipa. According to the Ramah, I believe it goes all the way through, and it's aser completely. V'tzir shel basar, unless it's hefsed meruba. V'tzir shel basar. She'oser, shenafal ala kli, tzarich hagala. And so if it's tzir, that's oser the kli, now you need to do hagala. V'imu kli cheres, tzarich shavira. And if it's kli cheres, then you have to break it. V'im, right, and if there's a derech to hechsher it, I guess ask your Rav, as far as, I don't know, waiting 12 months or not, or it's just because it's hefsed meruba, if it's expensive. So then maybe it could be mako. V'im, lo nafal rak al makom echad bekli eitz v'chayotzi bo kolef makomo v'dayo. And if it's wood, I mean, we don't usually do this with our dishes, but if it's wood, all you do is just sand it down and remove the top layer of the wood, and then that's your kedei klipa, and then it's butter. Okay. Okay, so the Ramah, I believe, when it comes to the kli, it's only kedei klipa. But when it comes to the meat, right? Okay. Vav. Heicha amrina deino ne oser ela kedei klipa kishein shum achad machaticho shmeina. Okay, so now what happens? We said it's only oser kedei klipa. So here, this will continue what we read before. So when we said it's oser only kedei klipa, that's when it's a lean piece of meat. It's called kachush. Kashe'ein shum achad machatichot shmeina. When there's no real fatty, greasy substance around the piece of meat. She'im haita shmeina kula asura. Because once it's very fatty and greasy, so we say it actually, the grease absorbs through and through the entire piece of meat. V'chein cheverta asura, kula. And even the thing that it's touching, even if one is fatty and one is not fatty, one is shemina, one's kusha, both of them become completely asur through and through, mipnei she'ashuman mifafea, because the shuman, it travels and spreads all around and through and through. And bubbles? Babea is bubbles, no? Okay. So like okay. So Siman, anyways, we will see more of this in Kuf Hey. And the Kaf HaChaim says that the minhag of the Sfardim in general is to be machmer like this, that we assume, what's in Kuf Hey? That we're not sure what's considered shmeina nowadays, similar to ein anan bekin, and we consider all pieces of meat to be shmeina. So therefore, any time you have an issue, we assume it's fat and it goes through and through. Okay. So I think not according to the Mechaber, but the Kaf HaChaim. Well, if it's shmeina, then that's everyone agrees. The question is, when you have a piece of meat in front of you, do you call that shmeina or not? So the Raman, Kuf Hey, says, Einanu bikin. We don't know. We'll just get this when we get to Kuf Hey. And the Kaf HaChaim says, generally the Sfardim Paskin, like the Ramah over there, that we're also not bikin. Okay. Yesh ladon. Tov. Let's do Zayin. Hadem efaginam bein nechal machmat mochel. Le'enu ma nechal machmat mochel animili bebasar chai. Okay. Now, when we say that it matters if it's salty or not to be maliach karoteach, that's with a piece of raw meat. Aval tzliroteach, really it means if it's cold meat, but we'll see. Now, what if it's roasted and it's still very hot? Shenafal limaliach, and it lands into something salty. Afilu ne'echal machmat mocho bai klipa. Even if it's not so salty, it doesn't matter because it's roteach, because it's boiling. It's right. It's hot. Let's assume we'll go with yad seledbo. As long as it's yad seledbo, it's still going to need bai klipa. V'imish bo. Okay. But if it's not yad seledbo, so then all you need is kadei klipa.
I'm saying,
I mean, then you just rinse it off, according to Moran.
even if it wasn't salt, the other thing which is a sefer falls into it shouldn't require this. What's the finish?
So the chiddush is coming up. V'im yeshbo b'kaim ashehu metuval b'tavlin. Now, what happens if this piece of meat, right? The basic case we had already in the siman. But what happens if you have a piece of hot meat and it has b'kaim, it has a bunch of slits or creases in the meat, or it's very spicy. Metuval b'tavlin, v'hu tzli roteach, kulo asa. So if it's both, it's hot and it has crevices or it's slit. You cut it or into slice strips inside or to open it up, or it's spicy. Then it goes all the way through. So according to Moran, according to the Shulchan Aruch, we learned if it's cold, all you do is you rinse it. But if it's hot, it's kadei klipa. If it's hot and has crevices or spicy, then it's the whole piece of meat's aser, and kadei klipa is not enough. According to the Shulchan Aruch, even if it has crevices and it's spicy, but it's cold, all you do is rinse it. When you see the Ramah goes, because it's a machloket rishonim, so they're basically on two opposite ends, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. By the way, what does it mean, spicy? So the Kaf HaChaim, in the name of Slu, writes, it must be where it's very spicy that you cannot eat it. It's too spicy to eat at this stage. The only way to eat it is you're gonna cook with it. It'll come down. You'll take off some of the spices. You eat it with something else. But by itself, you eat this food. It's too spicy. It's too strong. That's not okay. And it's either could be spices or it could also be onion and garlic. Anything that makes it sharp. Darkei Tshuva has an opinion that says, Yad Yehuda, I think, he quotes that he says, even if it's not that spicy, you can eat it, but you feel the sharpness. So two opinions, so that's what makes it where it goes through and through. Vehu adin, so the Ramah adds though, Vehu adin afui umavushal. The same halacha applies if it's baked or cooked. V'yesh omrim dafilu heim tzonenim dina hachi, and the Ramah holds even if it's cold, this is the halacha. Once you have a piece of meat that's cooked, Kaf HaChaim points out kemachal ben drasai. Once any piece of meat is cooked or roasted, baked, and it's for machal ben drasai, then the meat becomes soft. And even if it's cold, it absorbs. And therefore, kadei klipa, according to the Ramah, is not enough. If you get, if it's not batel b'shishim, you put some milk, it drips on a piece of meat. Even once it's cooked kamachal ben drasai, it's not enough to rinse it. It's not enough to do kadei klipa. If it's not batel b'shishim, the whole thing is aser.
Even though both the milk and the meat are cold.
Even though they're both cold. That's the Ramah. It's Machloket Rishonim, I forget, I think the Rosh is the Shulchan Aruch, and you can look it up. But anyway, yes. V'chein yesh linhog im ein hefsed meruba, and that's the halacha unless it's hefsed meruba. Look at the Shach. Right, so I think the Shach is Yesh Hayam B'Shach. I think he's agreeing with the Ramah, but he points out also that Mi'ikar Adin, he holds like the Shulchan Aruch, that one could be makel if it's cold. No, I think he's holding. He could be holding the middle sheet and the Rishonim. That if it's soft and doesn't have, yeah, that's the Shach argues a little bit. He takes the middle approach with the Rishonim between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. He says if it doesn't have bekayim and it's not salted, then just because it's sleeve by itself, then you can still just rinse it off. Okay, let's just finish chet. Ein basar b'chalav nesar al yedei melicha or yedei kivush ela ba'achila aval lo behana. There's no basar b'chalav. It doesn't become asr through. Um, when we said melia karateach or melia kavush karateach, and it makes it asr to eat, that's only a din derabanan. So now it's asr to eat it. Aval lo behana. But it's not derech bishul, and Chazal were never osert behana. And let's see if I wanted to add something. Yeah, fine. Stop here.